Lot's daughters. This is tragic. This is tragic. This is tragic. When Lot finally saw what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, he was terrified. Even more so, he fled to the mountains because God overthrew Zoar. God completely got Lot away from destruction, which is a testament to his love, and his strength shines in our weakness. The cave symbolizes protection, God's protection, and we even see that in the story of David. When Saul was hunting David, David spent most of his time hiding in caves. David had God's protection and favor. There's also a lovely parallel between verse 26 and verse 27 to 28. The imagery used here is quite beautiful. Lot's wife looks back and is destroyed. Abraham wakes up from sleep, sees also that Sodom and Gomorrah had been destroyed. It said that the smoke went up from a furnace. You may disagree, if you like, but the way I perceive this is that God sacrificed Sodom and Gomorrah not only as a warning sign, but to remind others who saw the destruction as a symbol of righteousness. Because you can picture Abraham looking toward the grave of those two cities and the smoke going up to heaven, because there's just so much of it. And lastly, it pleased God. The smell was most likely a sweet savor to his nostrils. The story of Lot's daughters is a rather interesting one, even though it's short. We have come to find that the shortest stories have the most depth. Lot had lost sons-in-law during the destruction, and now, at this moment in time, they believe they were the only people left, which is given to us in verse 31, and the 19:31. And the firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Let's now look at the mental state of these two young girls, because no one in their right mind would do what they did to their own father. So let's look at what happened. You could say that they had been traumatized. That's what I'm going with. They were traumatized and institutionalized by Sodom. When they lived in Sodom, you can most likely assume that they had spent the majority of their time in hiding. The Bible doesn't give us that explicitly, but it's an understandable assumption based on what we are given regarding Sodom and the people who lived there. So in order to preserve the purity of his daughters, Lot would have had to keep them hidden. That's the first way they were affected by these events. They had to spend most of their days in hiding, out of immense fear of being brutally violated by sexual savages. Lot had sons-in-law, but they didn't believe what Lot told them, so they stayed in Sodom and they were destroyed alongside their fellow sisters, meaning the only decent relationships the girls ever had been, the only decent relationships they had known had just been ripped away from them. Any chance they had at a happy and real relationship is now gone, because there's no example for them to follow. Their mother was turned to salt, and their sisters alongside their brothers-in-law had been destroyed also. This tells us something interesting about the symbolism of Sodom. Sodom represents destruction, but also represents a generational rippling effect it can cause. That's how generational curses work. Demons strategize generationally. If your grandfather can succumb to an alcohol addiction, then the chances are it will be used against your father, in hopes it will work for you as well. The destruction institutionalizes you. You grow up in an abusive household, then your perspective of life and how relationships work are going to be tainted. Your definition of giving love and honor might just match my definition of manipulation and taking advantage. And it seems that's what's happening here regarding Lot's children. The fear of brutal gang rape has followed them for the majority of their lives. But we can't say all their lives because we're not told when Lot's daughters were even born, but can impose based on what we have thus far that the chances of them being born in Sodom are quite likely. It's fair to say that they had been traumatized by the events of their lives thus far. We know that at this point in the narrative, there are in fact other people alive and well. But we're told 2 verses prior to that, Abraham saw the aftermath and destruction. This tells us that the girl's perspective of the world had been tainted and damaged in some way, because this is the power trauma has on the imagination. Your view of the world and those in it become tainted. You become a product of the environment, because when you spend so long living in a certain way, anything else seems wrong, which alludes back to what we were saying about the belief system, right? In Cain and Abel. At this point in time, Lot and his daughters are hiding in the cave, and they are terrified because they believe they're the only people on earth, which means they have no choice. They have no choice but to trick their father and have their way with him. In their minds, they were doing a good thing. But why? This act was not done out of love. The role of a woman, wife, was to bear children and to raise families, and women loved doing so. Lot's daughters understood this, but again, their perception had been tainted, because this was not done out of love, it was done out of fear. Lot's daughters were afraid of what would happen if they didn't do this thing, because in their minds, if they didn't do it, that the entire human species would have gone extinct, and it would have been their fault, which brings us back to trauma. They believed that the only way they could provide value to their father is if they slept with him and gave him children, because their entire lives until this point had been spent under that sexual fear. It's all they ever knew. They sleep with their father, and they give birth to 2 sons, which are named Moab and Ammon. This is how the trauma continues. The names of these children, Moab and Ammon, are not just the names of their children, but the heads of the nations. That's become an ongoing theme at this point. The women don't give birth to children, they give birth to nations, meaning Lot's daughters gave birth to these nations that became ungodly by what they worshipped. The main god of the Moabites was named Chemosh, but interestingly enough, not much is known about this false god. It's believed he may have been seen as a god of war and prosperity. It's also believed that Chemosh and Molech were the same idol. The main god of the Ammonites was named Milcom, which appears to be another name for Moloch. Chemosh, Moloch, also seem to be heavily associated with Ashtaroth, which was another idol that symbolized fertility and war. We all know this thanks to one passage in particular, which can be found in 1 Kings. It's 1 Kings 11, verse 4-7. And for it came to pass, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build an high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. There is an incredibly important theme here that connects these 3 idols, and that theme is childbirth. They're all associated around the act of sex, which brings us right back to Lot's daughters, as we were discussing. Demons strategize generationally. Excuse me. But I'm not saying that that's what's happening here, I'm just giving an example. And here the trauma and the psychological damage the girls were subjected to had been passed on to their children. Because instead of turning to God, these nations burned their children alive to please their gods, their idols. It holds close similarities to what happened in the cave. The sexual act is seen as the right thing to do because their perception has become so tainted by trauma, and now their children are going to do the same thing, which tells us something interesting about the cycle of trauma. Failing to break the cycle results in you becoming part of the problem. Now, of course, that seems rather obvious, but there's a specific way as to how the Bible makes this point. Throughout this story, we've been referencing the flood, But you know what? Last night I was lying in bed, and something dawned on me. There is another way these stories are interlinked. At the end of the story, Noah was said to have been so traumatized that by the flood that he turned to alcohol. His son saw him naked, and his grandson's generation was cursed, which led to the construction of the Tower of Babel. Well, the same thing is happening here, but with a little, but major detail. And that's at the end of the story. The daughters of Lot get drunk, sleep with him, which was all done out of trauma. Lot didn't reveal his own nakedness, his daughters did. They exposed him. We spoke about what it means to see your father naked, and it resulted in something dire, and here it's done the same thing. Trauma births dangerous idols. When Noah was naked, it was Nimrod. When Lot was naked, it was Chemosh and Moloch. By the girls revealing their father's nakedness,